The word being can sound like a museum piece, something only philosophers argue about. But Lonergan's claim is the opposite. Being names what your mind is already after whenever you ask any genuine question at all. In this episode, I want to give you a working grip on what Lonergan calls the notion of being. Not a very general concept and not a mystical fog, but the horizon of all inquiry, everything that can be known by intelligent grasp and reasonable affirmation. So we'll do 4 things. First, we'll define the notion of being the Lonerganian way, through the pure desire to know. Second, we'll make that definition concrete. Being is not only what you already know, but also what remains to be known. Everything about everything. Third, we'll see why the notion of being is unrestricted, spontaneous, and all-pervasive, and why it is also the core of meaning. And fourth, we'll situate Lonergan historically, from medieval debates, from Scotus and Aquinas, to Lonergan's own proposal that the unity of being is grounded not first in logic, but in the dynamic structure of cognitional process. So let's begin where Lonergan begins, not with a dictionary definition, but with your own conscious operations. You already know what it's like to want to understand. You confront something, an argument, a pattern in your data, a person's behavior, your own reaction, and you feel the pressure of a question. What's going on here? Why is this so? That pressure is not merely a mood, it's a drive. It's what Lonergan calls the pure desire to know. And here's the key move. That desire has an objective. It is a desire for knowing, yes, but not merely for the pleasant feeling of knowing. It's for what is to be known. It prizes correct understanding and rejects mistaken understanding, not because one feels better than the other, but because one is true and the other simply isn't. The pure desire is, in that sense, detached and critical. It wants the real. Now ask, what is the objective of this desire? Is it limited? Is it just this topic, just this field, just what is practical? No, not in principle. In practice, of course, we narrow our attention, we work within a discipline, we focus on one question at a time, but the ability to narrow presupposes something broader, an anticipation of more, a horizon beyond the particular issue at hand. Lonergan's definition is deliberately simple and deliberately radical. Being is the objective of the pure desire to know. Notice what kind of definition that is. It's not the usual kind where you list features, genus, and difference, like a triangle is a 3-sided polygon. This instead is a second-order definition. It doesn't tell you which items are in the domain. It tells you what it means to be in the domain at all. Whatever can be known through the process of questioning, understanding, and judging. And that's why Lonergan can say that being is both 1, all that is known, and 2, all that remains to be known. And because knowing reaches its complete increment only in judgment, only when you can responsibly say, yes, it is so, Lonergan can tighten it further. Being is what is to be known by the totality of true judgments. And I know that phrase can seem and feel overwhelming, the totality of true judgments, but it's not a claim that you or I could ever list. It's a way of naming the horizon that makes inquiry possible at all. To see it, do a quick experiment. Try to argue that being is not all-inclusive. The moment you attempt it, you have to mean something by outside. But anything you can mean, anything you can discover, invent, imagine, suspect, deny, falls under the very horizon you're trying to escape. That's Lonergan's point. The effort to limit being in principle is self-defeating because the very act of questioning already intends the all-inclusive. Now, that's a lot, so let's try to make that definition even more concrete. Suppose someone says, but there's much we do not know. That's obviously true. But how do you know that? Because you can ask questions you cannot answer yet. So being is defined not only by the answers you have, but also by the questions you can ask. Now, suppose someone says, but there's much it would be futile to try to learn. Okay, yeah, that's also true in a practical sense. But you can make that distinction only because you can distinguish between questions you can answer soon and questions you must postpone. Now, again, being is defined not only by what you'll answer this year, but also by what you recognize as still being open. So, now we can suppose another question to put this to the test. Suppose someone says, I don't want to know everything about everything. Okay, well, I'm sure most of us also feel that way. Fine. But that is a statement about will. It's a statement about effort. Maybe even about discouragement. It's not at all a statement concerning the objective horizon of inquiry as such. The fact that the horizon is unrestricted doesn't mean you will fulfill it. Of course not. It means that your intelligence is oriented beyond any particular stopping point. So, from this angle, Lonergan can give being at least one characteristic. It is all-inclusive. Apart from being, there is nothing. And he adds a useful paradox. Being is completely concrete and completely universal. Completely concrete because over and above the being of a thing, there is nothing more of that thing. Completely universal in the sense that because outside the realm of being, there is simply nothing. Now, at this point, you as the listener might object. You might say something like, okay, but isn't this all just a form of wordplay? Isn't being just a fancy label for everything? Well, here we need the next step. The notion of being is not merely a word, a single word. It's an operative intention in conscious process. Lonergan wants you to catch it in the act. Now, here's the surprising thing. You catch it precisely when you do something apparently restrictive, when you abstract and prescind. Think of a geometer considering a circle. The geometer abstracts from color, from size, inexactness, and everything else not relevant to the question at hand. That seems like narrowing, no? But Lonergan points out the very act of narrowing acknowledges a larger horizon from which you are abstracting, from which you are narrowing into. You can focus on circle only because you can also set aside everything else. And you can set aside everything else only because there is a tacit orientation to the whole. Or, take judgment. If I am judging whether this is a typewriter, for example, which is Lonergan's example, then I prescind from everything irrelevant to that specific issue at hand. But the very notion of irrelevant implies a universe of possible considerations that are being set aside. So what does that mean? It means that, in other words, even when you narrow, your mind's orientation implicitly includes a horizon beyond what is presently in view. This is why Lonergan calls the notion of being spontaneous. It's not a technical doctrine you learn first and then apply. It is what you are already doing whenever inquiry is genuinely underway. And he makes this point by contrast through that via. So, a fetal eye is oriented to seeing, okay? But it doesn't see and has no notion of seeing. It's in the fetal state, no? Hunger is oriented to food, and it is a felt desire, but it has no notion of food in the relevant sense. A notion arises only insofar as an orientation becomes intelligent and rational. Only insofar as it is caught up in questions, in insights, reflections, and in judgments. And that is what the pure desire to know is. It is conscious, intelligently, and rationally understood. So it's not only an orientation towards being, it itself includes a notion of being. So, saying all that, now we can state a major thesis. The major thesis is this: the notion of being is all-pervasive. It underpins all cognitional contents. Without the pure desire to know, sensitive living would remain within its routine of perception and action, in instinct and habit. What breaks that circuit is wonder, the beginning of inquiry. It penetrates all cognitional contents. It functions as the supreme heuristic notion. Remember in our previous episode on that topic. Before any answer, it is the notion of what is to be known through that answer. As each answer arrives, that blank in anticipation is partially filled in. Yet the filled in part becomes part of the anticipated totality, because the horizon remains larger than any given content. And it constitutes cognitional content as cognitional. Experience gives data. Understanding gives meaning. But knowledge is complete only in judgment. And judgment, through its outward form, may be a simple yes or no, an is or is not, is precisely the act in which what is known as being. That's why knowing is knowing being, even though the known is never the empty abstraction, being all by itself. So, where are we here after having said all of this? So far, we have spoken of being as the objective of the pure desire to know. Now, Lonergan doesn't stop there. He adds a further layer. The notion of being is also the core of meaning. And this matters. And it matters because many modern confusions about being are really confusions about meaning, about what it is to mean something, to refer, to signify, to talk about the world. Lonergan distinguishes sources of meaning, acts of meaning, and terms of meaning. Data and images definitely are sources. Ideas and concepts can also be sources. Judgments can also be sources. Words and symbols are instrumental acts of meaning. But what is the core that animates all of it, keeping meaning from becoming an idle play of concepts? Lonergan has an answer. And Lonergan's answer is, the core is the intention of being. Thinking is not just generating formal terms, concepts that can be entertained whether they are real or not. Thinking is a moment within a larger purposive movement towards judgment, toward responsible affirmation. Yes, it is so. This is why unicorns, or the phlogiston, Lonergan says, can be thought as formal terms of meaning, but they become idle or futile when they are known to be unsuccessful determinations of being. The core of meaning, this intention of being, loses interest in what does not lead towards true judgment. And this is also why Lonergan is so insistent against a crude empiricism of meaning. The empiricist tends to treat ostensive acts, pointing, gesturing, this as if they indicated not only a source of meaning, but the full term of meaning itself, as if the real were identical with what is sensibly present. But whether that is correct depends on whether empiricism as a set of propositions is true or false. In other words, even empiricism, to be affirmed, must submit to the same structure of inquiry and judgment. The already out there now real cannot be the final word if it cannot justify itself by reasonable reflection. Now, at this stage, it's natural to feel maybe a kind of puzzlement when discussing such complex topics. We use being constantly. The words like is, are, to be. And yet, when we try to define it, it seems either obvious to the point of emptiness or obscure to the point of uselessness. Lonergan calls it a puzzling notion, and he thinks the puzzle actually has a common root. We mistake a word, being, is, for the operative intention that gives it meaning. We confuse the instrumental sign with the conscious dynamism it expresses. So, the way out is not to stare harder at the word being. No, that's not going to get us out. The way out is to attend to the operations, to see that the notion of being is the immanent orientation of cognitional process, prior to conception and going beyond it, prior to judgment and going beyond it, because it is what drives us both to think and to ask whether what we think is so. So, saying all of that, now we can finally situate from Scotus, Duns Scotus, to Aquinas, to Lonergan, that line, that trajectory, with some degree of clarity. Historically, disputes about being often center on the unity of the notion. What does that mean? It asks, is being said univocally or analogically? Okay. Is it a highest genus? Is it a concept with minimal content? Does it refer to existence or to essence or maybe to something else? Lonergan's strategy is not to dismiss these kinds of questions. No. But what he tries to do is he tries to relocate their ground. He argues that many such debates remain within the field accessible to the logician. That is, within the analysis of concepts and terms. But in doing so, it misses the dynamic basis that makes any concept meaningful in the first place. Still, that being said, the historical positions remain nonetheless instructive. Aquinas, in Lonergan's presentation, takes seriously Aristotle's question, what is being? And recognizes that the question is, in effect, a disguised why, that is, a search for a grounding. Aristotle's move was to relocate an immanent cause in each being, substantial form. But that answer generates a problem about unity. How can being be one notion if it applies across such a diversity of things? Aquinas' deeper move is to locate the ultimate ground of being in God. God's being is self-explanatory and necessary. God's being is identical with God's understanding. And by one act of understanding God, he knows himself and therefore knows the range of what can be produced via divine power. Where's Lonergan here? Well, Lonergan has a striking move. His formulation is that God is the act of understanding that grasps everything about everything. And what does that mean? It means that on this view, the divine idea of being is comprehensive in a way our intellects cannot match directly, because our intellects are potential and developed through inquiry. We define being only at a second remove as whatever is to be known by intelligent grasp and reasonable affirmation. Now, we mentioned Scotus. Where does he fit in here? Well, Scotus has a contrasting position. By contrast, it's associated with a minimal and univocal notion of being, a common factor present in all our concepts. Lonergan grants that there is something right here, but he reinterprets it dynamically. What is common to every conceptual content is not a shared logical ingredient that you can merely isolate like a chemical element. What is common is that every concept is underpinned and penetrated by the intention of the pure desire to know its unrestricted objective. From instance to instance, the conceptual content differs, but in every instance, there is an enveloping and anticipating intention, that is, an orientation toward being, one that makes the content more than mere wordplay. But that being said, then we have Lonergan, who adds a decisive criticism. He says that if you set aside the dynamism of that intention, if you freeze being into an empty concept, you nullify not only what lies beyond conceptual contents, but the intention itself. And here he appeals to a Thomistic remark, saying that being has existence in and through essences. If you try to have being apart from essence, you end up with a notion that cannot exist. Effectively, the notion of nothing. And this is precisely where Lonergan draws a provocative comparison. Scotus, he suggests, could avoid the being collapses into nothing conclusion because he tended to conceive knowing as taking a look. Whereas Hegel, for example, seeing the issue in a completely different way, felt driven toward the dialectic of being and nothing. Now, whether you agree with that historical diagnosis or not, the philosophical point remains sharp nonetheless. That is, being cannot be reduced to a thin concept without reference to the dynamism of inquiry and judgment. Now, all that being said, through this historical trajectory, I think that now we can state Lonergan's own position in one clean line. That is, the notion of being is the immanent, dynamic orientation of cognitional process, detached and unrestricted desire to know, as operative in inquiry, insight, reflection, and judgment. That is why being is not some mere scholastic puzzle piece you can add onto your theory of knowledge already prepackaged. It is already there as the horizon of any serious questioning. And that is why being matters for objectivity. If you think in the naive realist way that objectivity is nothing other than just seeing, then being will collapse into whatever is already out there now. But if you follow the argument of this series up to and including this point, you already know that knowing is structured, experience, understanding, judgment. The true object is what is responsibly affirmed, and the horizon within which any responsible affirmation is possible is the notion of being. So, as we do in every one of these episodes, let me end with a practical consolidation. If you want to test whether you have grasped the Lonerganian notion of being, you can ask yourself 3 questions. The first question: do you recognize the pure desire to know at work in your own questioning? That is, not as anxiety or that sense of compulsion, but as a detached drive toward truth. Ask yourself that first question. Second, do you see that being names the objective of that drive, what is known and what remains to be known, so that being is not a content among contents, but the horizon of all contents? That's the second question. The third question: do you see that meaning is not just having concepts, but a purposive movement toward true judgment, and that the core of meaning is precisely this intention of being? If you can say yes to those, you are no longer treating being as just a word. What you're actually doing is you're treating it as what Lonergan is after, the operative horizon of inquiry. So, that being said, in the next episode, we'll turn from the horizon to the standard, objectivity, how truth and being are not decorations that are merely added onto knowing. What they actually are the intrinsic fulfillment of the norms of attentiveness, intelligence, reasonableness, and responsibility. If that's where you want to go, like this video, subscribe, turn on the notifications so you don't miss it.